Welcome to the RESISTIRÉ podcast. RESISTIRÉ is a research project funded by the European Commission to analyze the impact of COVID-19 policies on gendered inequalities. At the end of our first project cycle, we created a set of 8 fact sheets with practical recommendations to mitigate the social, economic, political, and environmental effects of COVID-19 policies on gender inequality. I'm Claire, and in this podcast series, we discuss the content of our fact sheets with the researchers involved in their creation and introduce you to some of the project's findings. Today's conversation is about women's representation, diversity, and inclusion in decision-making. I spoke to Marcela Linková and Sara Clavero, 2 researchers who investigated the topic.
Hello, my name is Sara Clavero. I am a doctor in political science, specializing in gender politics and policy in the European Union. I am now the Deputy Director of the AIB Center Research Center on Inclusive and Equitable Cultures at Technological University Dublin. I am a member also of the research team in the RESISTIRÉ project. And as partners in this project, TU Dublin contributes to different parts of its implementation plan, making a particular contribution to the qualitative elements of the research.
My name is Marcela Linková. I am the head of the Center for Gender and Science at the Institute of Sociology in the Czech Academy of Sciences. And in RESISTIRÉ, our team is responsible for policy analysis. So we're looking into the details of what the countries actually designed in response to COVID-19. But then we're also responsible for developing recommendations and working with those recommendations towards different types of stakeholders.
A number of studies highlight the extent of women's underrepresentation in decision-making and the invisibility of their voices in COVID-19 policies. So, what trends were observed during the pandemic in terms of decision-making? Who has been responsible for taking decisions in different areas, and why?
The lack of women representation in decision-making actually was reported since very, very early in the pandemic. At first, the attention was mainly being drawn to women's head of state and the difference that they made. For example, there were studies, and they were very widely publicized in the media at the time, that found that in countries headed by a woman, the number of COVID-19 cases and deaths was lower than in the majority of those other countries where the head was a man. These differences in cases and deaths were linked to different ways of responding to the crisis according to the gender of the head of state. For instance, like women head of state imposed lockdowns earlier. That's an example. However, there is not much agreement about the causal mechanisms there underlying this phenomenon. However, apart from the gender of head of states, there have been very significant gender gaps in decision-making in other key areas, such as government task forces or the media. For example, in relation to COVID-19 task forces, an analysis looking at the composition of these expert task forces found that the overwhelming majority of these groups, pretty much 85%, were made mostly of males, and only 30.5% of these groups had gender parity. Women were also quite invisible in the media. In relation particularly to female presence in media stories. Where are the women's voices and opinion in the media? For example, experts mention in relation to STEM, in relation to the economy, and also politicians mentioned the majority were men, and only very, very tiny minority were women. For instance, in STEM, only 5% of women mentioned, and economy experts, only 5%, and only 17% of politicians mentioned in media stories were women. Another example of the lack of female presence we found it in government daily briefings, providing information about the pandemic. One example we find in the United Kingdom, a study of government briefings that found that 43% of these daily briefings were composed of an all-male lineup with no female politician or expert present.
So in our research, we have several examples of countries where the lack of women in decision-making has really shown the negative consequences of this. And so I, for example, come from the Czech Republic, and we really had very few women in decision-making positions. You would say practically zero. And this included also governmental advisory bodies. And because of this, we could see that a lot of the policies that were put in place really did not reflect the needs of, for example, single parents who are predominantly mothers in the Czech Republic, did not take care of the sectors of the economy where women are predominantly employed, and also did not take into consideration the fact that women would be the ones who had to juggle employment and caring for children. And this related to the homeschooling predominantly. And one thing that then became also apparent is that women's organizations, because of the various pressures, had really difficult time organizing to push for change, and it took some time. But then in the end, the Czech Women's Lobby definitely drew attention to the fact that, for example, the Economic Recovery Committee was extremely male-dominated, and more examples started coming to the fore. So then the public opinion and the media started paying a little more attention. But at the start, this was completely under-recognized.
A lack of female representation in decision-making has various negative consequences, which were exacerbated during the pandemic. How has the inclusion of women in policy-making made a positive impact?
Yes, one very good example of how women's representation can make a difference in policy. We find it in Lithuania, where the furlough scheme was affecting expecting mothers. And this was because expecting mothers on furlough were not entitled to their full maternity and childcare allowances. At first, it was very, very difficult to change the legislation to correct this. But after several attempts, this finally happened after an election in 2020 that brought a more gender-balanced executive, and the legislation changed in favor of expecting mothers. So that is an example of how women's representation can make a difference in policy.
Inclusive decision-making isn't only linked to gender. It's also about involving organizations at the regional and local levels, particularly those that are in contact with vulnerable groups of women and men. Are there any better stories of inclusive decision-making in this sense?
We have a couple more examples from the Nordic countries, from Denmark and Sweden, where it is clear that when you have women in leadership positions, you also anticipate the involvement of civil society organizations a little more and pay attention to the fact that the civil society organizations do bring things to the table and provide solutions. So, for example, in Denmark, the Minister for the Social and the Elderly had monthly meetings with civil society organizations for really long periods during the pandemic, and this has had impact on the solutions that were developed. Or in Sweden, a similar interaction was also observed between the public authorities and NGOs. And this, for example, also related to addressing gender-based violence with the Association of Municipalities and Regions. So it's not only about the types of solutions that get developed, but also the stakeholders that get invited to the table, and they bring experiences of other vulnerable groups, for example, that tend to get marginalized in the policymaking process.
Sweden, as Marcela says, provides a great example of collaboration of civil society organizations with public authorities at the municipal level. At the national level, this collaboration, this good example of collaboration, we found in Ireland, also around gender-based violence issues. They work together, CSOs and government, and also the private sector, to develop a campaign that was entitled Still Here, the Still Here campaign, where government actors and NGO actors and private sector actors, as I said, were involved. The campaign was a major TV, radio, and social media campaign tackling the issue of gender-based violence during COVID-19. And what the campaign aimed is to reassure victims that services were still there despite the lockdowns and that victims were being prioritized. They wanted really to highlight that restrictions of movement did not apply to a person escaping from a risk or harm or seeking to access essential services. And the campaign also wanted to provide guarantees that these services would remain open at each of the different stages of restrictions.
The topic of gender-based violence is really a crucial one, and it goes as a sort of red thread through many of our findings. And so another example of this important cooperation and mobilization is in Turkey, where women's organizations and civil society organizations came together, and reflection on the rise of gender-based violence has also created space for reflecting on the fact that Turkey has withdrawn from the Istanbul Convention and could discuss the situation that has been created during the pandemic and the solutions that needed to be put forward.
It is clear that a greater representation of women in decision-making, combined with an explicit focus on diversity and inclusion, can make a significant contribution in overturning the worst effects of COVID-19 policies on inequalities. So, how can public authorities render their decision-making more inclusive? What can they concretely do?
From our research in RESISTIRÉ on this topic of gender in political decision-making, we drew a group of 3 main recommendations. The first recommendation is to increase gender equality, diversity, and inclusion in public authorities and decision-making bodies, especially to ensure that gender parity in expert decision-making committees, task forces, and advisory bodies is ensured. But apart from gender parity, it is also very important to build gender competence. And this gender competence at all levels across government agencies and other decision-making and implementing bodies. We also recommended that it was very important the representation of women and men from vulnerable groups in policy deliberations. This means the representation of women and men with a migration background, from ethnic minority groups, as well as those representing people with different abilities are examples of such groups.
So one thing that was coming out very strongly from our data was really the underrepresentation of women in the expert media roles and how rarely they were included in providing expert comment on the situation. And so this is really a vital component of having also women's roles represented in the media and seeing that they contribute to the development of the solution. So clearly, especially public media needs to pay attention to the fact that women are included in expert roles. I mean, across the board in the EU, we have dominance of women in the medical sciences. They were the ones also among on the front lines as nurses and teachers. So they need to be included and their experience needs to be heard. And a second aspect of this is that the media content really needs to reflect properly the gendered realities that the pandemic was creating, and the fact that it was impacting women and men differently. And this is an aspect that very often in the media content was also missing.
The third group of recommendations concern the collaboration with civil society organizations. This collaboration between public authorities and CSOs should be strengthened, and as the country example of Sweden that Marcela was describing before really shows the central importance of this, particularly those organizations who are in contact with vulnerable groups of women and men. The activities of CSOs targeting specific groups of people are, for public authorities, also an excellent example of the need to adopt intersectional approaches when addressing issues related to the pandemic.
As we've seen today, policy responses during a crisis often overlook the consideration of gender equality and diversity issues. A more gender-balanced decision-making and the involvement of civil society organizations has a demonstrable positive impact. Fortunately, we've seen many examples of this already in action. You can find out more in our fact sheet, including recommendations to policymakers, on our project website. A huge thank you to our guests for speaking to us today. You can find out more about the project and everything we discussed in this episode on our website, resistiré-project.eu. You can also follow the project's news on social media. We're on Twitter at resistiré_EU. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.